Hello everyone, John from Western Maine Defensive Tactics. Today we're going to talk about folding knives versus fixed blades. And I'm here to tell you why folders suck. And not just to be controversial, but I have decades of experience with knives. I started using knives when I was quite young, and I've seen folders fail and have had folders fail in a variety of environments, doing a variety of things, and seen some pretty serious injuries result. That said, folders among the knife-carrying public are the overwhelmingly more popular choice over the fixed blade for a couple of different reasons. Convenience. It's easy to carry let's say a small or mid-size folding knife, slip it in your pocket or clip it on your pants or your pocket, and go about your day. It's not a burden to most people. It doesn't require a belt or a substantial waistband or anything like that. Even in the old days, you had to have pretty good pockets to have a pocket knife. The fabric had to be fairly substantial to take that wear day after day. But things have changed a little bit with the advent of the popularity of the pocket clip. Another reason is legality. In a lot of jurisdictions and locations in various countries, there are length restrictions on if you can have a locking blade or not, and a bunch of other basic bullshit like that. If you've seen my other video on the carry of knives, you understand where I come from with that. But that's another thing that limits people's perception of their choices. I'll say it won't limit their choices because they're the same. It limits what people are willing to do in public. It limits let's say the risks they're willing to take. And finally, the light duty chores that we face in let's say an urban or suburban environment, they don't always require the superior ability of a fixed blade or a straight knife. Anyway, that's kind of why the folder has taken off, in addition to several other factors of manufacturing technology and things like that. But anyway, let's get into why folders are not high on my list when it comes to real working knives. I'm not saying I don't like folders. I do like folders. I have a variety of them, of course. This is like a tenth of the folding knives that I own. I don't have a count on that right now. But anyway, let's get into it. The primary thing I see as a drawback on a folder, I'm going to use this one as an example. Folders are already broken. You're carrying a broken knife that has at least 3 pieces. You have at least a blade, a handle section, and a pin of some type. And if you look at various historical references, you'll see folding knives going back thousands of years. The Romans had folding knives. If you look at, or in various museums in the country and in the world, you'll see folding knives from various time periods. Still surviving, many of them, especially your bronze-handled versions, still in fairly decent shape for being as old as they are. Now, why is that? Is it because folders were so durable back in those days? No, I don't believe so. It's because in particularly more rural environments, proper tools were more accepted and more available, meaning there are axes and larger knives and things like that available. So folding knives were the lighter duty utility tools that they actually are. They're like a backup thing, things to cut string, cut patches, cut cloth, open packages, stuff like that. Basically the same types of duties we do today with folders. Anyway, so folders are already broken, convinced to be held together by a pin. And regardless of the lock that you use, that primary pivot pin is a very crucial part of that system. And many folders were made, and some are still made, with a riveted pin construction, meaning it's not a micro screw like is very common these days. It is a solid piece of cylindrical metal, usually 1/8 of an inch or less in diameter, that is put through both the handle material, the blade, and the other side of the handle material, and any liners that are involved, and is peened, or generally pressed, into a riveted head. So the heads are larger than the diameter of the actual shaft. So that pin doesn't walk out. It doesn't go anywhere. They are adjustable if they loosen up by repainting them, but that's something that some people aren't comfortable doing. And if you do a bad job, you can bend the pin and really mess up the action of your knife. What my biggest problem is with folders these days is the use of micro screws. Now, if you look at the micro screws that are used and commonly used in modern folding knives, you'll have a larger head section and then a tubular section that is female threaded on the inside. And of course, I'm using my hands here, showing something that's much, much bigger than what we're actually talking about. You're talking about a fairly small, thin pin with a thin tubular section that is made further thinned by the addition of the threads cut on the inside. That coincides with the male section, which is small diameter, made smaller still by the threads that are cut on the outside diameter of it, and it threads into the female section and forms the pivot pin. So, raining pretty hard out. While those two are screwed in tight, it's smooth sailing. It creates a nice smooth pivot point and holds the knife together. What happens is, through use and time, one side or the other, usually the male side, walks out. When that happens, particularly when you're using lateral force, i.e. prying like this, if you don't have the male side on this, the female side can pop out of that liner or that handle scale, and basically the integrity of your lock and your system just fails. If you're doing something that, using a knife in an environment where you can't actually see the knife, like you're inside the carcass of a deer or something, and you're prying on something, you shouldn't pry with a knife, but anyway, if things like this happen, and they do, you could fold that knife right up on your fingers. And with half of that pin still intact, it's still going to guide that blade down into the blade channel and fold up on the blade channel in that handle right where your fingers are, and you're going to go to the hospital and get some stitches. And that's just what happens with folding knives. I'm not saying they're complete crap, but I'm saying don't have too much trust in the locking system. Now, let's look at the handle scales. The handle scales are often held in place with micro screws as well. And what tends to happen is these are smaller micro screws here than what is on the pivot. The pivot micro screw is small enough as it is, but these are even smaller. And they tend to walk out and get lost, and your knife basically falls apart. You can still open this knife, you can still use it, but this isn't a knife you're going to want to carry in this condition. It's ridiculous. Come on. Also look at the thickness of these liners. That's less than or about 1/32 of an inch. I haven't measured it, but just by using my eyeball gauge. So how many actual threads are you going to get in that thickness? 1.5, maybe 2, depending on how fine it is. So you're talking about taking a very small, fairly weak screw, putting it in here, screwing it in there, screwing it into that liner, and having that hold your knife together. Granted, folders are generally light duty, but that is and it's not a high stressed area. But at the same time, if you look at what people expect to do with folding knives these days, you're asking a whole lot from something very small. And I know some of you are going to say, because I've got all these knives here that are all falling apart, gee, John, why don't you use Loctite? Well, guess what? Generally, when I get a folding knife, I'll get the proper bit, the Loctite. I'll back out each individual screw one at a time, degrease it, Loctite it, and put it back in place and snug it up. And guess what? With time and use, those micro screws still tend to back out and fall out. I've got one knife right here that I've carried this knife for a few years now. The pivot's Loctited, these screws are Loctited, this screw was Loctited, but I looked at it one day and that screw was missing. No idea where it's going to go, no, where it went. And you think you're going to go down to your local hardware store and replace that? Well, you'd be mistaken. Sure, I could order another one from SOG or whoever, but at the same time, a riveted pin would not have that happen. Riveted pins, like this is an old cold steel knife, riveted pin, riveted pin. Riveted pin for the pivot, riveted pin for the locking bar pin. That knife is 20-something years old or so, and is still in good condition. It served 3 different owners. So if you're going to get a folder, I would look hard at riveted pins. Every knife I have with riveted pins is one I carry on a regular basis every day. Riveted pins. They don't back out. They don't fall out. They stay in place. No, they're not whiz-bang technology. They don't allow you to take the knife down and play with all the parts and put it back together and all that good stuff. But they do allow you to have a functioning tool day after day after day. But John, these 3 knives are fairly inexpensive. This one ran about, I think I got that on some kind of a deal at Walmart. I think I paid $20 for this knife. And it was, I mean, it's a Ruger branded CRKT knife. Really cool knife because I like the blade. It was, you know, ground fairly thin, got really sharp. Pretty nice little knife. This is a Spyderco Bird, not a junk knife. This is the least expensive and the least quality knife. It was, you know, it's a Camillus, but still a pretty good knife. All three of these blades were my son's carry knives at one time. So the criticism of, oh, hey, these are all inexpensive budget knives. Why don't you buy something really good? Okay, I'll play that way. This is a combative edge folder. This is not an entry-level knife. This is a really good knife. Lost the pivot pin, the male side. I replaced that with just this little cap screw I found at the hardware store and tried to get the company to replace it, but they no longer make these knives and it's just not available. And this is an excellent knife. The action on this is pretty nice. Blade is ground really thin, so it gets really sharp. Pretty good handle, fairly lightweight, but again, micro screw construction makes it kind of, let's say, not frontline equipment. I could round that off and still use the knife, but I would really like a proper screw that fits that. So we've talked about micro screws versus pins and riveting and all that kind of stuff. Yes, you can mitigate that with some Loctite and having proper tools, but how often are you going to have the, you know, number 25 Torx or whatever it is that you're going to need to keep those tight? Because they tend to be proprietary, especially I believe Benchmade has its own Torx, because I have a little Benchmade kit that I bought years ago for a specific knife I had. But it's just not as practical to carry that stuff with you as it is a regular screwdriver. Though, I suppose if you carry a Leatherman with one of the driver sets, you can include a bit for that to maintain your folding knives. So, the other part of folding knives that people have too much confidence in is the locks. I don't care who made it. I don't care who designed it. Those locks can fail. Let's take a look at this buck knife. This is I was going to call this a Buck Light. It's not a Buck Light, but it's the next generation Buck Light. A lightweight, basically 110 with polymer handles. If you look at your, let's get in the camera here. If you look at your notch right here, this is the notch that the locking bar fits down into. If you let this notch fill with crud, pine needles, pocket lint, dirt, blood, cartilage, whatever else of whatever you're working on, wood chips, that locking bar may not engage fully, even though sometimes it feels like it does. And then you go and start your process of gutting out your deer or whatever, and this blade loosens up and folds in on your fingers, and off to the emergency room you go. Or you're in the backwoods and you got to take care of it yourself. Not ideal, but in my life I've seen many people, well, let's say not many, but enough to make me very cautious, have that happen to them. And these weren't people who were inexperienced with knives. In fact, I've driven a few to the emergency room, and I've been driven myself, and I've drove myself a couple of times for folding knives not doing what they're supposed to do. Oh, look at that. That's another thing that can happen. That blade didn't close all the way. How'd you like to have that in your pocket? Anyway, so moving on. Remember that those micro screws can also get stripped. The threads strip easily. The heads of the screws strip easily. Replacements may or may not be easily available. Anyway, let's continue on. Over time, even good quality knives lose screws and fall apart. And yes, you can stay on top of it, but it seems like that's a waste of time to me, because there are better construction methods out there. So, with regard with folding knives folding up on your fingers, there's one, let's say one exception to that. You can use one of these, Balisong. This knife is not going to fold up on your fingers. Lock it shut. You have 2 pivot pins, double the pleasure, double the fun, double the strength. And these things are not going to shear and have this knife fold up on your fingers. The downside of this, and you can see that it's got 2 micro screws as pivot pins, and one of the let's say initial shootings of this video, I noticed that I was missing a micro screw right here. That's why I don't really flip this that vigorously. I don't even use this knife that much. I don't carry it anymore. It sits in a drawer and I play with it now and then. But even then, even with Loctite, that little screw went someplace on me. I'm not going to be able to replace it. So watch your micro screws. Mind your micro screws. Until we find something a little better than a pin, I say stick with pins. And I realize that most of the time, the Balisong has become a fidget spinner or a toy and not a practical tool. And that's kind of too bad, because I used one of the old Benchmades quite a lot on the farm when I was a kid, and it was a great tool. That's why I'm a big fan of them. Very safe folding knife to use if you're going to use a folding knife. Anyway, let's continue on. Let's talk about fixed blades now. Why a fixed blade or a straight knife is a better choice. Well, they will not close up on your fingers under use. They're not going to happen. That's not going to happen. You have a piece of steel, and regardless of the quality of that piece of steel, even if it's a junk, let's say a complete junk stainless steel Pakistani knife, that piece of junk stainless steel is still stronger than even a really good folding knife, because you're not going to shear this piece of generic steel in this direction and have it cut your fingers off. Something like that. It's going to bend first. You're going to know that something is amiss in Disneyland when you start putting that kind of pressure on that knife. Even if the steel isn't as thick. I've seen a lot of folding knives that compensate with really thick blade stock, and I'm a fan of thick blade stock on some types of knives. You guys already know that. But on a folder, you're trying to compensate for the weakness of a already broken knife with thicker blade stock. But are you increasing the diameter and heat treatment of the pin? Are you increasing the strength of the surrounding material that holds that pin? Probably not. Anyway, they're not going to close up on your fingers, and they're not going to collapse in a thrust, or much less likely to do so, depending on the construction. They are faster to get into action. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying and say that I said that I am faster with you than you, that I am faster than you with my fixed blade than you are with your folder. I'm saying that you will be faster with a fixed blade than you are with your folder. Yes, you can have a switchblade, you can have an assisted opening, whiz-bang knife, and all that good stuff. And all that stuff works great while it works. The problem is you have springs that break on assisted opening knives. I've had many an assisted opening knife because I for many years, I looked for an assisted opening knife that was small, that I could carry in certain locations, and I found them unreliable because, well, basically for the same reasons why I don't like very small concealment pistols, because the parts are delicate and they don't take high wear very well. And to me, the smaller the knife is, the smaller a knife is, the more specific it gets in purpose. But we will get into that later. Generally, fixed blades have simpler construction. You get more knife for your money because they can, with only a couple of components to make, the individual components can be better quality, better steel, better heat treatment, better handle attachment, that sort of thing. And they tend to be a little less expensive. You get more bang for your buck with an inexpensive fixed blade than you do with an inexpensive folder. Case in point, I was in Tractor Supply the other day, and they had a little, mossy oak or something folding knife. Had about a 3.5-inch blade and like a ballistic nylon sheath. No, not a real barn burner as far as the quality of the individual knife, but it was a fairly full tang knife, less than, let's say about an 1/8 inch thick or so. So that with a good heat treatment, even a half-ass heat treatment, that's still a fairly strong knife compared to a $10 folder. You know, something like this. That, are you gonna trust that micro screw and that lock and that little blade as much as you would the $10 fixed blade? I wouldn't. I would trust that fixed blade more. And of course, we're talking about kind of an extreme scenario, because if you're choosing a very inexpensive knife, I think you're better off to go with a used knife, like something like an old carbon steel kitchen knife, because that's got thin steel, but that's got excellent heat treatment. It's going to take a hellacious edge. Anyway, the drawbacks of fixed blades, and we're going to get into this in a later video, and I'm going to show you a couple of different knives here. But the drawbacks of fixed blades depend on your environment. I live in a rural environment, and frankly, I'm old enough where I just don't care anymore. You're going to need to wear a belt. I wear a belt every day anyway, so it doesn't bother me. You're going to need to secure the sheath that you need to carry the fixed blade to something to be able to reliably carry it and not lose it. You're going to need to maybe dress around that knife a little bit. And there are a lot of people that say, well, I can't carry a fixed blade because somebody's going to see it and blah, 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 blah. I've carried knives since I was in the single digits, guys. I started out with folding knives and very quickly graduated to a fixed blade knife or knives. And I've carried them in a couple of different countries in many different states, including some pretty large cities on a long-term basis. I carried fixed blade knives every day when I was in California. And I did it in what they call a non-permissive environment at my workplace and while at work. And I never got hassled for it more than once. And because I took serious measures, and I took it very seriously that I was going to have my knife on me, but nobody was going to see it. Those are things that you need to work out on an individual basis. And I'm not telling anybody to go out and get themselves in trouble by thumbing their nose at the law. At the same time, I've noticed over the years that how you comport yourself and how you handle yourself, how you dress, how you come across as a person is a lot more important than having that knife on your hip. If you have that knife on your hip and you're very conscious of that knife, and you walk into the room leading with that knife, everybody is going to notice it. But if you're more discreet with it, you blend the, let's say, the sheath and the handle color to your t-shirt or the shirt, or you have a shirt over it, something like that, and you get a chance to engage people in conversation in that. And I've talked to people with an openly carried knife many a time and had them not even know, because they were talking to me, we were talking about different subjects, and they never even noticed. Most people in most places aren't looking for a knife carried a particular way. We can get into that in later videos. Anyway, I think the fixed blade should be your choice for just about every purpose, because fixed blades are the real knives that get real work done in the real world. Folders are good for a secondary or tertiary knife. In the real world, throughout most of human history, we did not have folders, or at least they weren't looked at as primary working tools. Whereas now we're getting over civilized, and frankly, civilization is getting bitchified, where people will get uncomfortable seeing, a small knife like this. They get uncomfortable if you have this on your belt. And guys, I've dealt with this subject my whole life. The things that people will say about you when you carry a knife are, I mean, I've heard it all before, and frankly, I just don't care anymore, because knives are all-purpose useful tools that have been useful for millennia, and some dipshit who's going to put some 2-cent psychology on you probably, very likely, does not understand the history of knife use and what edge technology does for us on a daily basis. They exist as a beneficiary of that, but they like to look down their noses at it, despite its obvious benefit. But anyway, let's look at some knives here. So, this is one of my carry knives. I have literally a box full of carry knives, of my old carry knives. It's got a Velcro belt loop with my old hand stitching here. This goes on went on my left side, Velcroed on the belt. The pressure of the belt kept that Velcro from coming apart. If you guys that have been around cold steel knives for a hot minute will remember the old Cold Steel Trailmaster Velcro belt loops, that's where that idea comes from. Because when I got that, my first Trailmaster way back when, I was like, Velcro belt loop, this thing sucks, it's going to come apart. And nope, about 10 years of carry changed that opinion. A belt loop on my pants goes right here, and this secures the front of the sheath. This carries almost completely horizontal and comes in and out. I have basically a cammed welt in the sheath, so it doesn't fall out. And it's a little kind of a thick, stubby knife, and I use this a lot. I used to use this a lot for various things, because this being on the belt line was a lot more convenient to reach under my sweatshirt or my shirt in the winter, pull this out, cut my hay bales, do whatever I had to do. Very handy design. But I moved on to other things. Here's another carry knife. I carried this knife for a variety of years. It's a little rougher than it used to be because I sharpened it back quite a bit, so I had to put it on the grinder and thin it down a little bit. Still nice and sharp. A bit of a Persian or Turkish shape, but this is a handle shape that I worked out a long time ago. I've got several different knives with variations of this handle shape. A couple of them that I rehandled cold steel knives to this handle configuration. I've got I want to say I have one of the Oben or Coben Tantos in one of my first versions of this handle. But I like this because it's nice and thin, and like a what was it? Bud Neely Peshkab I used to have. I used to like the thinness of that knife. That was one of my carry knives when I was in California. And I like that knife, but it had some drawbacks. It didn't hold an edge very well. I made this out of 1095, and this holds a wicked edge. This was like I said, this was my carry knife for several years until I decided I wanted something else. But this was one of the knives that, when I first made it, it was a very nice, shiny, nice-looking knife. And a lot of people tried to buy this off my belt, and I ended up making a couple copies of it. But again, it's one of my favorite, and some of the features on this are going to get revisited in my later knives. Anyway, so some of you, like let's say 3 of you, they're going to watch this video. 3 of the 5 people that are going to watch this video actually know me in person, and you've heard me state that I'm going to eliminate folding knives from my life. And 1 or 2 of you are going to say, yeah, I've been hearing that shit for 20 years, John. When are you going to make that happen? Well, this is part of the process. I based this knife on this knife because this is one of the ones I carry in my pocket. It's almost the same size. What I've done is I forged out a piece of 5160 leaf spring and gave it a pretty good thin grind. And what I'm doing is I'm going to make this a pocket fixed blade. Once I get this heat treated, I'm gonna do a little bit more grinding on it, probably relieve the handle a little bit more. I added these little brass scales just because I think they kind of look cool, all, you know, hammered and peened like that. Make sure I'm still on camera. I just think it'll look cool, and I might antique the rest of it once I get it heat treated. But the idea with this is, the smaller the knife, the more like a scalpel it has to be for it to be, let's say, useful to me. Because my smaller knives, I used to dig out splinters. I used to do really fine work. So this one's going to replace this knife. I'm going to put a pocket sheath that I dummy cord to a belt loop on it, and just keep it in my front pocket. Pull this knife out. The sheath will stop when it reaches the end of the dummy cord, and I'll have my knife in my hand. Won't break. Won't fold up on my fingers. Very, very strong. Still could throw it, and it will be basically a flesh eater in my pocket. On a budget, I think I paid I think I might have paid 50 cents for this knife at a yard sale. It was all rusty and I cleaned it up. This is an old hickory paring knife. Now, with some duct tape and some cardboard, you can make a really good sheath for this. If you had some hard plastic or some, let's say, PVC pipe, you could warm it up over a fire or in an oven. Press a nice little sheath for yourself right out through here. Again, the fixed blade is held back by sheathing, and that's something that I've got some ideas to. And a lot of people will say, well, John, you need to use clips because everybody's going to clips. Well, I've got clips. When it comes to clips, I've been there and done that. And oh my God, look at all these clips. 1, 2. Oh, I got literally a pile of Ulti clips here. And I could pull a couple more off the wall too. Do I like Ulti clips? Well, I do, but I don't like it as much as I used to. When the Ulti clip first came out, I thought it was the bee's knees. I was like, yes, this is a good solution because this is a clip that seems to be well made. It's not going to get sprung. It's going to last. Well, that's not quite what happened. After carrying a knife with an Ulti clip, I found out they do get sprung. Granted, they're kind of repairable, and as far as clips go, they're a pretty good clip. I like these leather loops. This leather loop, I think, might have come off this sheath from years ago. I've used this leather loop on several different sheaths. With a pull-the-dot snap, it stays in place. It's pretty stable. It floats a little bit. You can move your sheath a little bit, but your sheath stays on your body, and it secures it well enough where you can grab that knife with some authority, and the sheath stays in place. The knife goes in your hand where it should. So that's some of what I think about, let's say, a utility or smaller fixed blade, carrying every day. I've been there and done that with it. I've done it for decades, for years, in a variety of environments, and yes, you can do it too. Again, I'm not going to tell you to thumb your nose at the law. That's your own decision. But, you know, here we are in a world where people are committing crimes every day and not paying a price for it. So I guess I'm not all that interested in obeying every little edict from on high that the powers that be throw down on what I can carry personally. But anyway, consider incorporating fixed blade knives into your life because they are faster, they are stronger, you get more bang for your buck, and they're just better knives. They're real tools. Don't have too much confidence in your folding knives. The folding knives like this are awesome because you wouldn't go out and try to pry and baton and all that with a folding knife like this. You'd realize that, hey, this is a fairly thin blade. It's got a very thin edge. I'm not going to do anything stupid with it. I'm going to use this like the cutting tool that it is. But we live in a different world now where people seem to get off on destroying things and call that testing. But anyway, incorporate a fixed blade or two into your daily carry, and I think you'll be very happy you did, very satisfied. And this is a subject that we'll revisit with various knives and a review of some of my old carry knives in the future. All right, you guys, take care. See ya.